Hey everyone, congratulations on joining us for the Gender in the Workplace conversation on communication bias. Rarely discussed but powerful, communication biases perpetuate gender inequality in many workplaces. For example, why is one person described as aggressive by some and assertive by others? And how do these biases actually impact their ability to deliver? We'll be discussing this topic amongst others with an aim to give you the tools and ideas on how you can improve your workplace. We'll be exploring this with our gender equity advocates. Annika Freyer, CEO of Coalition of Champions, Ben Pollack, CEO of Urbis, and Krissie Jones, the Executive General Manager of NAB Business Banking. If you want to put your hands together. So let's begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we join today's meeting. For me, it's the Wathaurong people. Can I ask any of you to add yours into the chat? And on our behalf, I pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and future. And in the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to the land, sea, and community. And I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. We extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So welcome. Why are we doing these webinars? Well, many of you know that we're running the Gender Equity Awards for Australia, and they are on next week. So lots of excitement going on at Camp Business and Heels. And we're lucky enough to come across a lot of best practices. In fact, we should actually know the results within another, 6 days. So it's a very exciting time, and I think best practices are really worthy of discussion. So let me introduce our particular guest today. Let's start with Krissie. So Krissie Jones is the Executive General Manager for National Australia Bank, the small business bank, and she's over 25 years of experience in banking and financial services. In her current role, she leads a team of 1,500 bankers who look after the financial needs of over 800,000 businesses across Australia with a suite of products and services that support every stage of a business's existence. So, big role, Krissie, from welcome. Can you share with us briefly why you're so passionate about gender equity?
Thanks very much for having me, Lisa. It's a privilege to be here with you and the other panellists today. I've been really passionate about this topic for a long time, and part of the reason is I deeply believe in fairness. But what the evidence points to is just that when there is equity and equality in the workplace, the results are actually amazing, and that we see diverse teams actually have far superior outcomes to those where there's less diversity. So it just makes good business sense. Plus, I think just as being a person who's interested in other people, it makes a lot of sense too. But I really want my team to be reflective of the customers we serve. And as you've just spoken about, we have a team of 1,500 bankers across the country, and we need those bankers to really represent the clients that they're serving as well. And that's really important to me too. And that could be around gender, it could be around ethnic diversity, religious backgrounds, the whole suite of aspects that make people different. And that's really important that we really do have a workforce that reflects our customer base. That famous saying of, if you can't see it, you can't become it, is really important too. And so I think that's really important, is that we do have role models that we can see, that we can strive to be like, is absolutely important. And banking and finance is traditionally not a very gender balanced place. That's really changed and shifted, and I'm really pleased with the progress that's been made. But of course, there's lots more to do. And the place that I work in now, compared to 25 years ago, there's definitely huge differences and progress that's been made. But like many others, I've got 3 kids, 1 male, 2 girls, and I just would be outraged if my daughters didn't have the same opportunities as my son in the future. And so that keeps me striving to create more balance as well.
Oh, that's awesome. Thanks so much for sharing, Krissie. Our next panelist is Ben Pollack. He's the CEO of Urbis, and he's been that since 2016. He's been at the forefront of driving and consolidating growth in leading professional service firms for over 2 decades. With a passion for leading through aligned and empowered cultures, his experience spans the legal, accounting, consulting, and property industries. So welcome, Ben. Can you share with us briefly why you're so passionate about gender equity?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lisa, and a pleasure to be here also. And I think, look, Krissie, in terms of the point she made around business sense, client base, providing role models and opportunities, I would absolutely agree with and echo those comments. Probably the one additional item for me, though, when I think about the question is the word equity. And that's the really important word here for me. And particularly when I reflect upon the Urbis experience, we're a consulting business. People are our greatest asset. And apart from the moral principle of fairness, if we're not committed to an inclusive and equitable workplace, we're actually limiting our ability to attract and retain the best talent. So for us, as a talent driven business, we want the best talent. And why would we limit our availability to all the talent if we weren't an inclusive workplace?
Yeah, well said, Ben. Appreciate that. And our next panelist is Annika Freyer, who is the CEO of the Champions for Change. Annika's led the strategy and evolution of sustainable and scalable model, enabling the Champions of Change to grow from its founding group of 10 CEOs to the internationally recognised coalition of more than 250 CEOs. So amazing growth with a really strong focus on innovation and disruption, action to shift systems of inequality, many of which are now considered global standards for organisations aspiring to be employers of choice. And I think you were recently in the US, weren't you, at, yeah, exactly, talking again at a global stage about what you're doing. So welcome, Annika. Annika, share with us a little bit about why you're so passionate about gender equality.
Thanks, Lisa. I'm delighted to be here. So in terms of my passion, I think just overall, I'm a bit of a social justice warrior, for lack of a better term. And I've worked in government, at intergovernmental agencies like the UN and not-for-profits. And for me, gender inequality is really one of many structural injustices, but it's an absolutely massive one as it impacts 50% of the population, right? And I will say I'm particularly passionate about the issue, but I'm especially passionate about our approach to tackling it. So I might speak just very briefly about the Champions of Change Coalition that you mentioned, Lisa. We were founded back in 2010 by Elizabeth Broderick, who was our sex discrimination commissioner at the time. And our mission is really to create cultures of care, respect, safety, and belonging where everyone can thrive in the workplace. And it's really built on the understanding that gender equality is a social imperative, not just a women's issue. And we actually we have a goal of inclusive gender equality within one generation, which is a bold goal. It's aligned to the government's by harnessing the power and influence of senior leaders. And what I love about the work is that the heart of it is collective action. We know that no organization can solve gender equality alone. So we unite that coalition, as you mentioned, Lisa, from corporate, government, and community to create amplified impact. And we also serve as an innovation hub, very much like this forum, to share our practices and solutions, but where members can trial those real world solutions together, and through listening and learning to experts and the insights, drive change. And finally, personal leadership and accountability are key pillars. So all of that together makes the strategy quite disruptive by design. And I'll just close by saying it's not about fixing the women. So many strategies are. It's about shifting the system and sort of working with the levers of power to do that.
Absolutely. And I think, it's just such important work, I think, that everybody has a part to play here. And unless we're all aligned, nothing will change. But I love the idea. I might see it in my lifetime. So I've got my fingers crossed.
Let's give it a go.
Exactly. So let's explore an example of communication bias. To set the scene, it covers numerous different interactions that happen in a business and society. These behaviours range from interruption patterns, speaking time, contributions in meetings, assumptions based on parental status, and encouragement bias, just to name a few. What we plan to do is discuss each scenario and explore different ways our panellists might handle this. So let's start with the language use in performance reviews. Women might receive feedback that is focused on their communication style, like you're too aggressive or you're too emotional, rather than on the performance outcomes. And this is often combined with voice and speaking style. So women's voices might often be criticised as being too high-pitched or shrill, especially in leadership roles. So, Krissie, you have experienced this. Can you share your story and but not exactly what you did about it till the end?
Okay, sure. This topic makes me groan because unfortunately it's still one of those things that plays out today. I even just recently recruited someone who's moving from regional Queensland to Melbourne, and she's concerned that she needs to change the way that she speaks. And it's like, absolutely not. We just need to be open to difference. And, it's really concerning that still does exist these days. So firstly, I think it's really important to be yourself and to have that natural language. The things that are your style, and that is what makes you different. Not to say that we all don't have ways to improve our communication style or other things, absolutely, but is it the thing that should stop you from being listened to? No. I've got a friend of mine who was and a business mentor who had been passed over for running a global team because of communication style. And the feedback to her was that she wasn't projecting enough confidence. And I have to say, I just hate it when I hear people, particularly women, being told that they're not confident enough. I actually don't know any men that have been said that the same thing has been said to them in the past. And, confidence can only be built by giving people the opportunity that is equal to others and to really develop over time. So that was one that just made me really frustrated, because for this person, her results were absolutely outstanding. In fact, the best of any of the candidates that were put forward, but she was looked over because of that language piece and communication style. Thankfully, if I can get to the outcome, she was in time able to go on to bigger and better things. But it's one of those things that really does seem to only be said to women, is something that is very difficult to shift in terms of perception. And really, we all have unique and different styles. So when I'm coaching people, and I even had someone I was talking to about this exact topic last week, some of the tips that I've able to give from my own experience is that you can only build confidence by projecting, and I say confidence in the eyes of others, by having a say and having those opportunities. So it's about how does everyone help with that? And even in instances where I see women being spoken over in meetings, really actively saying, hang on a second, Lisa, for example, had a point to finish. Or even when we go to electronic meetings and Zooms or Teams, to really make sure people are using things such as the hands up buttons to really be able to get their point across. And even when I'm on large meetings on Zoom, I'll actively look for people coming off mute, because I want to make sure that everyone's included rather than just being overlooked. And I think there's a real risk in different formats that it's very easy to only hear the people that are loudest rather than inviting everyone to participate. So really important to be very conscious of it though, and to see whether or not there are dominant voices, not always hearing from others. But never, my recommendation is never give someone feedback to say that you're not confident enough, because that is quite difficult to shift as a perception and really unfair.
It's a bit like saying you're too emotional, or, when you just have an opinion. Ben, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, look, I think Krissie's made some really important points, including the role leaders have too in forums around creating equal voices, which I would wholeheartedly agree with. I'm also mindful, as the only male on the panel, that I haven't been on the direct receiving end of some of the examples that have been provided. But I guess there's two things that I would add when I think about my observations of the evolution of some of the things we've done here at Urbis. And probably the first is a very deliberate shift away from how we do things to the impact. So very much when we think about performance reviews and assessments, whether they're interim or full year, what was the impact of the activity rather than how you got there? And that's not to say style isn't a relative consideration. It absolutely is, and the adherence to values and so on. But I think Krissie made the point as well. We certainly value diversity in leadership, diversity in perspective, but also diversity in style. So we don't try and create an homogenous leader. We try and work with the strengths of every leader to exacerbate those particular strengths. And even within that, if I think about some of my leadership team and even the senior leaders here at Urbis, I found generally, I think women have a far more diverse leadership style and probably have a natural inclination to be more inclusive and probably have a higher EQ anyway when it comes to leading teams, is a real strength in terms of style and leadership more broadly.
Thanks, Ben. That's great. Some really valuable points there. Annika, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to jump in on Chrissy. I was interesting Chrissy's point about, noticing when someone goes off mute, on and off mute, for example. I think there are a lot, speaking of communication bias, I think there have been a lot of advantages of the shift to virtual over the past several years, many disadvantages as well. But what I love is on any screen, also, you sort of have the same share of space. There's sort of long-standing gender norms about the space and that women take or are conditioned by social norms to take interruption, share of voice. And while some can dominate in a virtual platform, it's actually harder or it's more noticeable, I find, because you're all sort of have this equal box. And if the noise is always coming from that one spot, you feel it. There are also different ways to indicate, not just the body signals, like Krissie said about going on and off mute or putting it in the chat. If you want to comment, you can be called on for different ways to contribute. And I would say that that's a great example of, instead of giving someone feedback that they're not coming off confidently, but shifting the structures to help enable them to have more confidence, if that truly is the case. It may not be, it may just be a bias, but supporting them with structures, for example, team meeting design or event design, to help ensure that there's share of voice.
Yes, some great points there. And I think inclusion's obviously, the focus that all three of you've brought up, and how do you make your team more inclusive? It'd be interesting, Krissie, just to touch on a bit about the performance review, because quite often in performance review, it's one-on-one. And so quite often the person that's being reviewed, there's a bit of a power imbalance. And so they often take things quite personally. Have you got any ideas of how somebody could actually address back, where they get that sort of feedback and it may be a bit irrational, not related to their results, how they can actually help the person who's giving them the feedback to reframe it a bit?
Yeah, I think that's a really good challenge, Lisa. My suggestion would be to come in prepared for performance reviews with some facts around what you have delivered, what your results have been, and hopefully having had some key objectives set out at the start of the year or the start of the performance period helps. I realise that's not always how every organisation works, but having some of those facts is really important to be able to anchor back to that, and even to say, well, things such as, could you just help me understand how this relates to my performance outcomes? Could we just talk to some of these outcomes that I've delivered, and trying to reposition that. If it becomes more difficult, and sometimes when you are receiving more personal feedback, it's hard not to respond. And so sometimes deferring and asking for some time to consider the feedback and to come back can just create that separation as well, allowing some space, some thinking time before responding, and doing that at a time when you feel like you can have a better conversation and not feel it so personally, can help as well. And often that doesn't have to be the same day, that can be a few days later, a week later, but to come back to it and to also say, well, that actually made me feel as though you weren't recognising my actual performance. Could we talk about my actual performance, would be my suggestion.
Yeah, I love that. Some really great actionable ideas. Does anybody else have any other ideas to add?
I think just prompted by Krissie's comments and probably reflecting upon situations where I haven't got it right, I think the important thing too is setting up an environment where you have permission to give the feedback. It's not just given in the moment, it's about how you set up the relationship and the dynamic and how you lead into it, and the mutual objective that you're trying to achieve and working towards that objective, so you can provide constructive feedback that's aligned towards a goal and isn't perceived necessarily as critical, I think would be an important element I'd also add.
Yeah, that's really valuable too, Ben. Thank you. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the representation of women in media. Annika, you have a story to share on this and some information from the Women for Media report on gender bias in Australian newsrooms. So please do share with us.
Sure, and it's less a personal story. I just thought it would be really timely, given the topic of bias, to chat about a recent report, as you noted. So I might give some of the insights from that report to start off with, and then we can have a bit of a chat. Does that work, Lisa? Yeah. Look, gender bias in the media is obviously a complex issue, but it's one that's really impossible to ignore. And the reason also I wanted to raise it is because it shapes not only how we see men and women, but also who we recognize as authorities and experts. And as Lisa mentioned, there's a recent report out by WILIA, which is Women Leadership Institute of Australia, called Women for Media Report. And it dives deep into the issue, and it's got data and statistics, and it shows essentially that big gaps remain in Australia's major newsrooms and news outlets. And so I thought I might just dive into 4 areas where those gaps are. The first is really the segregation of story topics, so gender segregation on story topics. And the research finds that men dominate hard news topics like politics, business, international affairs, which are often seen to be more prestigious, whereas women, on the other hand, are more likely to be assigned to soft news stories like lifestyle, health, and the arts. And in fact, men are 3 times more likely to cover economics and nearly twice as likely to write about politics. So, it's a pretty significant gap. Then there's also the issue, second of all, of front page visibility and exclusivity tags in the media. And only 37% of front page articles are authored by women. And men are more than twice as likely to receive the exclusive tag, which again signals that prestige and authority to readers. Third, there are imbalances in opinion pieces and syndicated articles. And opinion sections really strongly shape, obviously, public opinion. Again, bring that gravitas and sense of authority, and they remain entirely male dominated really heavily. And men contribute to nearly 2/3 of opinion pieces and are more likely to author syndicated articles. And that means they reach a broader audience, right? So story and syndication is important in that it tends to amplify the reach of bias of those stories. So if they're male dominated and they're syndicated, the content is going to be skewed throughout, and the gender narrative will be set across multiple media outlets. And then the final issue is underrepresentation of sources, which is interesting and important too. So when it comes to expert sources, the gap is actually even bigger. Men account for 78% of quoted voices on the front page. And again, that speaks to the fact that men are deemed more authoritative by media, which is an issue. I think it's obvious that with these findings, it's a stark picture. But it's also no wonder that then there's a trust gap growing, with 48% of men trusting news compared to only 39% of women. And, perhaps that's just many women simply don't feel reflected in the news stories. And just before closing, I also want to touch on the fact that women in the media also face much more intense scrutiny and harassment compared to their male counterparts. So according to that report, female journalists are more frequently the targets of online abuse and harassment. And I suppose that might have the chilling effect, impacting those other statistics on women wanting to put themselves out there in public facing roles or, in business. And the reality is, it's our society is heavily influenced by this. So it's something I thought I'd raise, even though it's not necessarily what my personal experience is, not being in the media.
Because you are heavily in the media. So,
well, I mean, a little bit. No, I mean, I'm not in the media. Yeah, like as in a journalist or an executive.
Yeah. So, Ben, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's a pretty eye-opening report, which I've only become aware of through Annika. So only recently getting across it, and I guess there's 2 things that immediately it sparks for me is. Obviously, it's a concern from a role modelling perspective, and I think the comment was made earlier: you can't be what you can't see. So, it's clearly an imbalance that we need to work on, and then reflecting upon, well, what can I do about it? And I know as an organisation, we think a lot about gender balance in a lot of activities. We assign to the 40-40-20 rule. very closely aligned with the property industry. It's something the Property Council have been very strong in pushing. And so therefore, in event representation, we move towards a 40-40-20 expectation for all our events. And maybe it's something we need to think about for media representation as well. And I guess for us, not so much mainstream, but also use of things like social media. So for me, I think it's food for thought in terms of, as a leader, what can we do to try and project a greater balance? I don't know what our balance would actually be. Right now, it's not a metric that we report at the moment.
I think awareness, these reports, spark off awareness, and then, action can come thereafter. But you're right, most people wouldn't be aware of this. Krissie, what are your thoughts?
I think some excellent points have been made, and as you've said, Ben and Annika, it's that piece around making sure that we've got diverse representation. So locally, like back to the things that I can do, similar to Ben, try to make sure that whenever we're running internal town halls or leadership gatherings, that we make sure that we've got diverse panels, whether that's the host or customers that we might be interviewing, that we have really strong representation. Again, I think that's important too, because it gives people a platform to be more visible, gives people more experience in speaking in public in different ways with different audiences. So we need to do things locally as well as address the more systemic issues that are happening in the media, to really help to build people with having that experience and seeing people that look and feel like them as well.
Fabulous. And I'd like to mention Leonora Riss, who actually is an economist, and she was one of the first female economists to get on to the ABC. So she guilted them into making sure, and she actually then set up a whole lot of programs to try and get women economists and raise their profile, because they weren't as seen. And a number of people number of young girls then went into economics as a result of seeing her on the TV. So, you're absolutely right. If you can see it, it creates that role modelling. Annika, was there anything else that you wanted to add to that?
No, maybe we can talk about practical interventions in the past. I thought those were excellent points made by Ben and Krissie in terms of how you can take action to avoid this, because I think it's everyone's role. So, of course, the media outlets themselves, ensuring that there's gender balance and representation in their workforces, and then having intentional moments in, the course of their business day when they're deciding what the key stories are, that bias disruptor of, okay, who are the journalists on it and who are the sources? But on the flip side, to your point, Ben, I think workplaces, companies can audit the face of their organization and really think through what's the gender balance in their approved corporate spokespeople, for example. To what extent are they encouraging female leaders within their organization to submit opinion pieces or to go out there in the news and speak about stuff? And on the flip side, I will say, to get more men speaking on issues of gender equality of the day, because that's an area that we'd like to see balance in too, right? So maybe have your chief economist, who you spoke about Leonora, who's such a prominent economist, but often in workplaces, the chief economists are men perhaps, and having them talk about a gendered lens on an economic policy or an initiative would be extraordinarily influential. So balance goes both ways on this one.
Yeah, great. There's some really great stuff in this. I think for people to take away some ideas, and we're seeing a lot of, that gender balance across events, because that's kind of, for many businesses, their version of media, sort of, the internal representation. So I think trying to keep that balance as much as possible is really important. So let's talk a little bit about the assumptions made on the basis of parental status, particularly in relation to part-time work. Ben, could you share with us your story and thoughts on this?
Yeah, look, the story that springs to mind for me, Lisa, unfortunately is one where I got it wrong. So if I go back several years now, and it was when one of my senior female leaders and a member of our leadership team went on parental leave and returned to the organisation part-time. And that may not have been unique, and it certainly wasn't unique in the organisation, but it was still relatively new. And it was important to me that we made this successful, and in particular, set up the appropriate boundaries around part-time work. My error, though, thinking that I was helping, was to exclude this individual from meetings and invites on their non-work days. My intent was trying to remove the expectation for them to join, thinking that I was being supportive. So whilst a very positive intent, I was actually projecting a bias. So fortunately for me in this instance, I knew this individual incredibly well. We had a very strong relationship, and they were able to raise it with me. So I must admit, it was to my horror, I became conscious of what I was doing, and I was severely restricting her opportunities and her right to choose. Fortunately, I guess at this time too, that was about the first time I did unconscious bias training, and it was quite a good practical and example of me as how I was projecting my, I guess, unconscious biases on an individual, and becoming more aware of it and what I could do to change it.
Oh, I love the fact that you shared that story with us, Ben. I think everybody's got so much to learn about unconscious biases in ourselves. It's such an interesting thing. So we actually do a short quiz every week. It's one question, and it's on a range of different topics, so people can just keep it front and center because you just never know what topic you've got a bias about. So over to you, Krissie. What are your thoughts about this?
I love Ben's example because I think that is so right in terms of you can have great intent, but the person that you're trying to help can have a different perspective. And I've been really lucky in a long career to have leaders who have taken the view of asking me what I would like. And so there's been instances, for example, I was promoted into my first exec role after coming back from having my first baby, 3 months after returning from work. That was extraordinary that my leader would support me into that and not make the assumption that I wasn't able to because of time commitments at home. Similarly, I had a leader who asked me if I'd like to move to India with 3 small children, which he could have easily overstepped, asking me, assuming that wouldn't be possible with a young family. So I'm always very conscious of making sure that we don't forget people. And even in the last couple of days, I've hired someone who will return from parental leave in April. That's quite unusual because I'm not demanding them to return now or not going for someone else because of their availability. So I think Ben's point is excellent, like just asking the person what they want, and it does differ for everyone. So in that instance you shared, Ben, like there'll be other people who absolutely don't want to have that day interrupted, don't want to be included, but we don't know unless we ask. So I think that would be the piece that I would encourage, is just to ask, and everyone is different as to how they want to be included or considered. But just knowing that there's such a diverse range of talent, that just asking the question, because it's you can overstep and assume and really narrow down that talent pool and opportunities for people if you don't ask that question.
So much valuable stuff in there, Krissie, I think. I think this idea of treating people as individuals and, the amazing talent that they are, rather than trying to put them in boxes and groups of people, is so important. Annika, what are your thoughts on what could be done about this?
Yeah, I love that, all of those reflections, because what I was thinking when Ben was speaking is really it goes to the heart of the fact that flexibility is a responsibility both ways. And it's really important because there can be power dynamics that mean you need to give team members permission to speak up and create those safe environments, as you were mentioning, Ben, to share. But I think also those, experiencing flexibility should also see it as their responsibility to share what works and what doesn't, and work on it together, because that's what it is flexible. So to say, look, in that example, I definitely can't be reached on these times, but I would love to know about meetings, so if I can work around them, that's actually my preference. And just to have that transparent back and forth, because I think sometimes we confuse flexible. We think of rigid flexible models and we call that flexibility, like structural flex, like part-time, versus thinking about flexibility. And that's especially, post-COVID, where we were all apparently flexible because we were working from home, but that was entirely unflexible, right? Because there was absolutely no choice. I think at the heart of flexibility is agency and choice, but with choice comes responsibility both ways. And I think to make it work, you obviously need a manager and an organization that embraces flexibility, but you also need to be this type of person and the employee who can take responsibility for what you need and how you can deliver that too. I think the challenge is when that's one side of that equation isn't living up to their responsibilities.
And I think the fact that parenting's dynamic, right? Whatever worked the first few weeks, the next 6 months, whatever, it continues to change and evolve over time, as it does when you add multiple kids into the mix. So I think just that
So is the
reflection.
job. Yeah,
Yeah.
the job's dynamic too, right?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, some really, really, really valuable stuff in there. So given the time of the year, let's explore the topic of Christmas parties and some of the potential pitfalls. Often people feel obligated to attend something out of hours, and for some, it's an added expense in addition to the time commitment. There are risks that people drink too much and then say inappropriate things or behave badly. How do we create an inclusive, fun event for people? So, Krissie, over to you. What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, well, the times of big open bar type Christmas parties are certainly over at our organisation, and I think many others as well. That's not to say that that doesn't happen still, or that there can't be unruly behaviour at times. I think it's obviously there's been generational shift just in drinking habits within Australia. So younger people are drinking less. More of the workforce is made up by those younger people. So being really conscious of who the workforce is important. We've taken some really practical steps. We provide clear guidance to people as to what is acceptable and what's not in the lead up to Christmas party season, making sure that people are really aware of what is okay and what's not. Also some tactics such as the time that the party might start, the different types of parties that can be held. So not always, for example, at a traditional pub, or it could be doing an activity like lawn bowling or other things that are fun, but don't necessarily have that element of heavy drinking to them. And also some of the time bound, so keeping it short and sweet rather than allowing it to go on for hours and hours are really important. But setting up those guardrails up front can really alleviate problems coming through the next day. And obviously we want to make sure that we've got safe workplaces for everyone, but thinking about your audience as well is really important.
That's great. I love all those guidelines. Ben, what are your thoughts on this?
Look, they're probably not hugely dissimilar to Krissie. We like to think that we consider a range of factors when we schedule events and make them as inclusive as possible, but we certainly don't get them right all the time. And I certainly would agree that I think cultures have changed. I think they're not big drinking cultures anymore, and we certainly don't condone that. But similarly, things for us like the timing of the event, access to the venue both before and after, providing transport on the way home, emphasising behavioural expectations, also making sure that we've got designated leaders who are responsible for wellbeing, as well as factors such as RSA and things like that, are really important. And look, I guess also acknowledging too that with things like the recent Respect at Work Act coming into play, I think organisations, if they're not already taking this seriously, will be going forward. So it'll get even more focus, I think, going forward. And it is, as you say, the season for this.
And Annika, what are your thoughts?
Gosh, not much to add because Ben captured the one thing I was going to add to Christie's fabulous list, which was just a representation of leadership staking through at the event, especially if you've got that time bound factor and making sure senior leaders are there until the end and responsible, essentially. They're sort of dedicated, responsible leaders in the room to help check and make sure everything's okay. But no, I think both Krissie and Ben covered that perfectly. I think the point is we need to redefine, and I think we already are, what fun means and what connecting can look like, and provide a wealth of different opportunities throughout the year, not just in holiday season, about how you connect as teams and how you enjoy each other's company. So
Yeah, and one other thought that I'd like to add that's come out of one of the finalists for the awards, they've actually set up an interesting change up in policy around public holidays, saying that people can choose to trade whatever public holidays they would like to support whatever their belief system is, so belief or circumstantial system. So I just thought it was such a nice way to allow inclusion of beliefs and systems, which, quite often we think about Christmas and, everyone gets excited about Christmas, but that's not for everybody. And so just, it was just a nice way of doing it. Now we have a question, so I'm going to read it out and then throw it open to you. So I was wondering, since women are underrepresented in senior leadership, how can we empower people to call out unconscious bias from their leaders who may not be aware or experiencing it? Any thoughts?
I've got a reflection on that. I'm sorry, go ahead, Ben. If you, I don't know if you see, we're noticing the mutes now, thanks to Krissie's prompt. But I was just, at least, I was going to just say that that I think it is quite challenging to call things out in the moment, and it's also quite challenging to call things out when there's a significant power dynamic. But there are other ways to go about, sharing the feedback. And I think one thing to do first and foremost is to look around the room, and you may also see other colleagues body language shifting, not be super happy to call it out, particularly if it's a gender dynamic. You may think that women are feeling that way, but the research shows that most men are also often feeling that way, and equally, perhaps not equally, but also uncomfortable. And you can look around and see, and perhaps after the meeting or after an incident has happened, chat to a colleague, and maybe that colleague or together you might find a little more strength in numbers or be able to find another path forward. I just, I would encourage people to find different and creative ways of sharing feedback if it's a challenge to go straight in the moment or with a power dynamic.
Good point, Annika. Ben, you had a point?
Look, I guess I think Annika spoke to it beautifully, and in fact, I was going to reference Champions of Change, and we don't have a formal, not a formal member of Champions of Change, but we certainly talk about being champions of gender equity, and we would have an expectation that senior leaders as champions would call out the behaviour if it wasn't being picked up upon and brought to the fore and discussed in a constructive way. So I was going to refer to Annika, but certainly creating those champions who have the permission and certainly an expectation that it is called out.
Krissie, any thoughts to add?
Perhaps just on more on the creating the environment for feedback. At NAB in the last few years, we've instituted a practice at the end of every meeting, which is called giving more, better, different, less feedback. And there is always one person assigned to do that, with others able to contribute. But what it's helped to create is a much safer environment in which to give feedback, but also receive feedback. And so you can see that over time that's really helped to shift the culture around that ability for feedback. Previously, it was sort of that it was difficult and you had to really have a relationship in which that was able to be done. So there might be practices such as more, better, different, less that could start to be developed in situations that just became a norm that then helps with everyone, not just the most senior people being willing to give feedback, but everyone having a voice on feedback. And we rotate who is the feedback giver each time. So it has really shifted then, the most junior team member in a meeting can be giving feedback to anyone, and it's really well respected because that is just our norm. So that's certainly made a big difference in giving and receiving feedback.
I love that. What a great idea. Thanks, Krissie. So what a fabulous discussion. You've learned a great deal about why communication bias continues in the workplace and some really simple roadmaps that can be implemented. If you want to be recognised as a male ally, because as we mentioned before, Ben, we need more of them, feel free to check out our website at Business in Heels. And a huge thank you to our panellists for sharing their experience and ideas. Thank you to Annika, Ben and Krissie. We really appreciate it.